She was 76 years old, and the lock on her own front door had been changed while she was at church. That is where this story begins. Not with a villain, not with a courtroom, not with a check or a deed or a legal document slid across a table. It begins on a Sunday morning in October with a woman in her good coat standing on her own porch, holding a key that no longer fit. Listening to the wind move through the wheat fields her father had planted 40 years before she was born. But before we get to that Sunday morning, we need to go somewhere else first. We need to go to a place 200 miles west of Tulsa, out past the point where the roads thin and the towns disappear, and the land opens up into something that doesn't have a name in any language that was invented indoors. A place where the grass grows sideways in October because the wind has never once in its life been told what to do. Picture it. A flat stretch of Oklahoma panhandle, the sky so wide it bends at the edges. And standing in the middle of that flatness, surrounded by nothing but dry grass and distance, a structure that doesn't belong to this century, or possibly any century you can easily name. 5 stories tall, 60 feet from ground to peak, built entirely from longleaf pine planks, gone black with age, fitted so tight you couldn't slide a blade of grass between them. 4 corner posts of iron, each one sunk deep into the red clay and gone to rust the color of dried blood. Along the sides, rows of small ventilation windows, each one perfectly spaced, running from the base all the way to the roof line, like the eyes of something that has been watching for a very long time. And above it all, a prairie Gothic peak, steep and narrow, and still perfectly plumb after 138 years of wind and drought and ice. On the south-facing wall, carved directly into the wood by a hand that has been dust for longer than anyone living can remember, 4 words. Hartwell Grain Esting, 1887. That is where Dorothy Hartwell is standing when we first see her. 76 years old, 5 feet 3 inches, her white hair moving in the October wind, her right hand holding a single iron key, her left hand pressed flat against the wood of that wall, feeling the grain of it, feeling the letters carved into it, feeling something she cannot yet name moving up through her palm and into her chest like a current. She has been locked out of her home. She has driven 200 miles on $1, and she is standing in front of something her great-great-grandfather built with his own hands the year Grover Cleveland was president, and she is realizing for the first time in 8 months of grief and confusion and quiet rage that she is exactly where she was always supposed to be. But to understand how she got here, we need to go back. We need to go back to the Sunday morning her son changed the locks. The Hartwell family came to Oklahoma before Oklahoma was a state. That is the first thing you need to understand about Dorothy, about the farm, about all of it. This was not a story about a woman who bought a piece of land. This was a story about a woman who came home to land that had been waiting for her for over a century. There is a difference. The difference matters. Ezekiel Hartwell was born in 1855 in western Tennessee, the third son of a family that owned nothing and expected nothing and had learned through long generations of poverty to ask for very little from the world. He was not an educated man. He could read well enough to follow a newspaper and cipher well enough to keep accounts, and that was the extent of what formal schooling had given him. What the land had given him was different. The land had given him patience. The land had given him the particular kind of stubbornness that does not feel like stubbornness from the inside, that feels from the inside, simply like knowing what is true and refusing to pretend otherwise. In the spring of 1886, Ezekiel Hartwell was 31 years old, unmarried, and in possession of exactly $43 and a mule named August. He had heard about the Homestead Act the way most men in his position heard about it, through rumor and letter, in the particular desperate optimism of men who have nothing to lose. Free land in the territory, 160 acres for a $10 filing fee and 5 years of working it. A chance to own something, a chance to build something that would outlast you. He filed his claim in Cimarron County in the spring of 1887. The land he drew was flat and exposed and windy in a way that felt personal. The kind of wind that gets inside your coat before you finish buttoning it. But it was good soil, red clay on top and dark loam underneath, the kind of soil that holds moisture and releases it slowly, the kind of soil that rewards patience. Ezekiel Hartwell walked his claim the first afternoon, with his hand trailing through the grass, feeling the ground through his boots, and he made a decision that would shape everything that came after. He was going to build something permanent, not a soddy, not a dugout, not the kind of temporary structure that could be abandoned if things went wrong. He was going to build something that would still be standing when he was gone, something that would tell anyone who came looking exactly who had broken this ground and what they had made of it. He spent the rest of 1887 and most of 1888 building the grain elevator. He hauled the longleaf pine from a mill in Woodward, 2 days wagon ride each way, making the trip 11 times in 18 months. He cut and fitted every plank himself, working alone most days, hiring 2 men from the nearest settlement for the heavy framing. The 4 corner posts he sank 6 feet into the clay before he ever touched the superstructure. He designed the ventilation system himself, the rows of small windows spaced mathematically, pulling air through the stored grain to keep it dry, to keep it from heating, to keep it from the rot that had ruined other men's harvests. When it was finished in the autumn of 1888, the Hartwell grain elevator stood 60 feet tall and could hold 4,000 bushels of winter wheat. Nothing else in Cimarron County stood that high. You could see it from 8 miles in any direction. Neighbors began bringing their grain to Hartwell storage, paying a small fee, and for the first time in his life, Ezekiel Hartwell had built something that the land and the community both needed. He carved his name into the south wall himself with a chisel, in a steady hand, the letters 2 inches deep. Hartwell Grain Eston, 1887. He was not a sentimental man. He carved his name into that wood the same way he built the elevator itself, because he intended it to last. It lasted. The generations that followed Ezekiel had lives shaped by the same land in different ways. His son Clarence inherited the elevator and the 320 acres in 1921. When Ezekiel died of a stroke at 66, his boots still on, standing in the wheat field on a July afternoon, as if the land had simply decided it was time to take him back. Clarence was 36 years old and had grown up watching his father treat that elevator the way other men treated a church, with reverence, with maintenance, with the understanding that some things must be preserved regardless of what they cost. The 1930s nearly ended it. The Dust Bowl came to Cimarron County like a judgment. The storms came on days when the sky turned the color of iron and the air tasted of copper, and the chickens stopped walking because they couldn't tell the ground from the sky. Clarence lost 2 harvests entirely. He lost the North 40 to erosion. He went to the bank in Boise City and took a mortgage against the land with a kind of quiet desperation that he never spoke of directly to anyone, that you could only see in the set of his jaw and the particular way he had of looking at the elevator in the evenings as if checking to make sure it was still there. He paid the mortgage back. It took him 9 years. He sold cattle he couldn't afford to sell and took work from neighbors he didn't need to take, and moved his family into 2 rooms so he could rent the rest of the farmhouse to a family coming through from further west. He paid it back dollar by dollar, and he never missed a payment. And when the final note was cleared, he sat down at the kitchen table with his wife and drank 2 glasses of cold water and said nothing for a long time, because some things don't need words. Clarence died in 1952. His wife Agnes took over the land at 42. A woman who had never been asked whether she wanted to run 320 acres alone, but found herself doing it with a competence that surprised everyone except herself. Agnes Hartwell was small and precise and had the particular quality of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having made a decision that cannot be unmade and choosing to live inside it without complaint. She ran the farm for a decade after Clarence died. And then in 1960, her own husband's debts caught up with her old accounts. She hadn't known existed obligations Clarence had taken on before the mortgage and never told her about. The county sent a notice. The unpaid taxes on the Cimarron land had accumulated to $47. $47. That is what the Hartwell homestead was worth to the county of Cimarron in 1962. $47 in unpaid tax, and a woman who had no more credit and no more cattle to sell, and a son, Dorothy's father, Vernon, who had just come home from Korea with a bad knee and a disposition that no longer found surprises welcome. Agnes signed the tax deed. She lost the 320 acres in the elevator to the county for $47. But before she did, she went into the elevator one last time with a hammer and a chisel and a wooden box and a candle. She was in there for 2 hours. When she came out, she locked the door and mailed the key to a notary in Boise City with instructions that would not be open for 40 years. Nobody knew what she had done in there. Not even Vernon. Not even Dorothy. Not yet. Vernon Hartwell came home from Korea in 1953 with the bad knee and a quietness that his mother recognized and his neighbors didn't. He was 25 years old, and he had the look of a man who had decided to be grateful for the things that were still intact and not to speak too much about the things that weren't. He married a woman named Frances Doyle in 1947 before the war, and when he came home, she was waiting, and their life resumed with the matter-of-fact continuity of people who have learned not to count on continuity. They built their life on the 160 acres of Tulsa County land that Agnes had kept, the land that had not been lost to the tax deed, the smaller farm that backed up to a dry creek bed and had a barn and a farmhouse and a kitchen garden, and the particular quality of belonging to a family so completely that even the trees seemed to lean toward the house. Dorothy was born on March 14th, 1948, in that farmhouse in the back bedroom, in the early hours of a morning that her mother would later describe as surprisingly quiet for a birth that had taken all night. She grew up on that land the way children grow up on land, when the land is all there is completely. The creek bed in summer, the barn in winter, the kitchen garden in spring, with her mother's instructions given in the specific shorthand of women who have worked alongside each other long enough to finish each other's sentences. The wheat fields in August, the particular golden light of late afternoon on standing grain, the sound of wind through it that is not quite music, but is not quite not music either. She knew every acre. She knew where the soil went thin and rocky near the east fence and where it went deep and dark near the creek. She knew which boards in the barn floor would hold weight and which ones wouldn't. She knew the names of the neighbors for 3 miles in every direction and their family histories for 3 generations back. She was in the deepest sense of the word home. In the autumn of 1956, when Dorothy was 8 years old, Vernon loaded her into the truck one Saturday morning without much explanation and drove her west. They drove for hours through the Panhandle, through the kind of country that gets quieter the further into it you go, until they came to a flat piece of ground outside Boise City, and Vernon stopped the truck and pointed. The elevator. Even then, at 8 years old, even then it was enormous. Black with age and standing alone against the flat sky, the letters on the south wall, still crisp, still deep. Hartwell Grain Estine, 1887. Dorothy pressed her face against the truck window and stared. Her father didn't say much. He never said much. But he put his hand on her shoulder and said, "That belonged to your great-great-grandfather. Our people built that. Don't forget it." She didn't forget it. She thought about it for a long time afterward, the way children think about things that impress them, without being able to say why, carrying the image of that black tower against the flat sky, the way you carry something in your pocket, reaching for it, occasionally checking to make sure it's still there. Then life happened. She married Earl Maddox in 1971, a man from Osage County who worked as a diesel mechanic and had a laugh that you could hear from 2 rooms away, and hands that were always slightly black at the knuckles no matter how hard he scrubbed them. Earl Maddox was not a complicated man, which was exactly what Dorothy had needed without knowing she needed it. He loved her in the plain, continuous, undramatic way of people who have decided on a thing and see no reason to revisit the decision. They had Brian in 1976. They worked the farm together for 48 years, the 160 acres that had been Vernon's, and before that Agnes's, and before that part of the original claim. Earl died in the spring of 2016, lung cancer. 6 months from diagnosis to the end, which is fast enough to be a mercy and slow enough to be a long goodbye, which is the worst possible combination. Dorothy sat with him in the back bedroom, the same room she had been born in, and held his hand on the last night, And when it was over, she stayed there for a while in the quiet, holding the old leather Bible that the family had passed down since Ezekiel's time, the one with the names written on the inside front cover in different inks, in different hands, generation after generation, Ezekiel and his wife, Clarence and Agnes, Vernon and Francis, Earl and Dorothy, 8 names, 4 marriages, 130-some years of Hartwells on Oklahoma soil. She did not cry then. Crying was something she did in private early in the mornings, when the house was at its most quiet, when the habit of making 2 cups of coffee caught up with her before the rest of her brain was fully awake, and she stood at the counter with 2 mugs in the specific clarity of loss that arrives before you have your defenses up. She got through the first year, then the second, then the 8th. She kept the farm running. Wheat and a small cattle operation enough to stay viable, not enough to get rich, exactly the kind of marginal agricultural life that requires a specific kind of stubbornness to sustain over decades. She hired a hand for the heavy work. She kept her account at the same bank in Tulsa she'd used since 1975. She went to church every Sunday at the Methodist place on Route 11 and sat in the same pew she'd sat in with Earl. And she did not move to a different pew because moving to a different pew would have meant something she wasn't prepared to mean. Has there ever been a chair in your house that no one sits in anymore? A place at the table that stays set from habit, not from expectation? If you have lived long enough and loved someone long enough, you know exactly what that feels like. Dorothy knew. Brian called once a month, not more. Brian lived in Tulsa with his wife Sandra in a neighborhood with a homeowners association and a mortgage that Dorothy suspected was bigger than the house was worth, though she had never said so. Sandra was from somewhere flat and featureless in Texas, a woman who wore her hair very straight and her opinions very straight, and who had always had the quality of looking at Dorothy's farm the way a banker looks at an asset, calculating something, arriving at a number. Brian was not a bad man. That was the thing Dorothy had always come back to in the long nights after Earl died, when she lay awake and tried to understand the shape of her life. Her son was not a bad man. He was a weak man. There is a difference. Bad men know what they are. Weak men don't, and the not knowing is sometimes more dangerous. In the years after Earl's death, Brian visited more often. Not more often because of grief or affection, which Dorothy would have recognized immediately. More often in the specific way of a man who has been told something by someone else and is following instructions. Sandra began coming with him. They would walk the property in the afternoons, talking in low voices. And twice Dorothy had come around the corner of the barn and caught Sandra mid-sentence before the conversation was adjusted to include her. She noticed. She said nothing. She filed it away in the same place she filed the winter weather reports and the machinery maintenance logs and all the other practical information that would eventually matter. And then the question started. Have you thought about what you want to do with the farm long term? Have you considered assisted living just for the security of it? We could help you with estate planning if you'd like. We know a lawyer. Dorothy answered each question with the minimum number of words required and did not invite the next one. But they kept coming. And then the lawyer actually appeared, a man named Frederick Plum, who wore a suit that was too tight in the shoulders and had the practiced warmth of someone who has learned to seem trustworthy in the way a tool can seem trustworthy before you notice the handle is cracked. She signed something. She couldn't remember clearly what it was. Sandra had said it was just paperwork related to the estate, just a formality. Everyone her age does it. It just means Brian can handle things if you're ever incapacitated. Would you sign a paper your child put in front of you if they said it was just a formality? If you were sitting at your own kitchen table in the house you had lived in for 50 years, and the person asking you was your own son, and his wife was smiling, and the lawyer was patient and soft-spoken, most people would sign. Dorothy signed. She had been sitting at her own kitchen table when she signed it. Earl's chair had still been at the table. She had been looking at Earl's chair. That was her mistake. Not the only mistake in this story, not the worst one, but the one that cost her the most. The Sunday it happened was the 14th of October. A clear morning, cold enough for her good coat the kind of October light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it actually is. She drove the 12 miles to the Methodist Church on Route 11 and sat in her pew and sang the hymns she had been singing in that building for 50 years and shook hands at the door after the service with Pastor Owen Griggs, who asked about her health, and she said fine, and she drove home. She turned into the gravel drive. She got out of the truck. She walked up the 3 porch steps and put her key in the front door lock. The key didn't turn. She tried again. Tried the motion slowly the way you try a lock that has been stiff. The key fit the hole but would not engage the way a key fits when the lock has been replaced with a different lock that only looks like the old one. She stood there for a moment, then she looked down. There was an envelope on the porch leaned against the door, thick cream-colored with the name of a law firm printed in the upper left corner. She recognized the firm's name. It was the firm that Frederick Plum worked for. Next to the envelope was a single large suitcase and 2 cardboard boxes. Her suitcase, her boxes, packed neatly, efficiently, without sentiment. On top of the smaller box set carefully apart, as if someone had gone to the trouble of making sure it wasn't buried, was Earl's old leather Bible. And beside the Bible in a small plastic bag, Earl's wedding ring and her own, both of them. She had taken them off during a kitchen repair 2 months ago and left them on the windowsill above the sink where she could see them while she worked. Someone had taken them from the windowsill and put them in the bag. The thoughtfulness of that detail, the deliberate consideration of it, was somehow more painful than anything else. She did not try the back door. She did not call out. She sat down in the old wooden porch chair, the one Earl had built from scratch in 1984 and repaired 3 times since, and she placed the envelope in her lap without opening it, and she looked out at the wheat fields for a long time. The fields her father had worked. The fields her husband had worked. The fields she had worked alone for 8 years after Earl was gone. The October wind moved through the standing grain. She thought about Earl. She thought about her father. She thought about the way her father had put his hand on her shoulder on a Saturday morning in 1956 and pointed at a black tower against a flat sky and said, "Our people built that. Don't forget it." She opened the envelope. The document inside confirmed what she already understood. The power of attorney she had signed at her own kitchen table was a general durable power of attorney, not a limited one, which meant it covered everything: the farm, the accounts, the equipment, all of it. Brian had used it to execute a deed transfer. The farm was no longer in her name. She read it twice. She folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. Then she took Earl's Bible from the box and held it in both hands and sat there in the October light for a while longer. She was not praying exactly. She was doing something quieter than prayer, something older. She was holding on to the thing that had the most names in it, the most history, the most of the people who had come before her and were now gone, and she was reminding herself very deliberately that she was not the last of them. She was not done yet. After a while, she picked up her phone and called the only person she trusted completely. Her great-niece Penny answered on the second ring the way she always did, as if she had been waiting. Penny Hartwell was 22 years old, the granddaughter of Dorothy's older brother, a young woman who had grown up knowing that Dorothy was the kind of person you called when things went wrong, because Dorothy had the quality of making wrong things seem manageable without pretending they were right. She was in her final year of law school, property law, her specialty, and she answered the phone with the alertness of someone who had been half expecting this call for longer than she would have admitted. The voice on the other end said, "Aunt Dot." "What happened?" Dorothy told her briefly, the way she told most important things, without excess and without softening. There was a pause. Then Penny said, "I'm coming to get you." Dorothy said, "Don't rush. Drive safe." She was not crying. She had learned long ago where crying lived and when it came, and this was not the place for it. What she had instead was something older and quieter and considerably more useful. She had the name carved in the south wall of a grain elevator 200 miles west. She had a key that had come to her from a notary office that had held it for 40 years. She had a great niece who answered the phone on the second ring. And she had the thing her father had said to her one autumn morning in 1956 with his hand on her shoulder. Our people built that. Don't forget it. She had not forgotten it. Not even now. Not even sitting here on a porch that no longer belonged to her with a key in her hand, that no longer fit the lock with the wheat field moving in the wind in front of her, and the whole long weight of her life pressing down on October light. She had not forgotten it. She would not. Penny Hartwell drove a 2009 Ford Ranger with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked on its own schedule, mostly not. She arrived at the farm on the Route 11 gravel drive 40 minutes after Dorothy called, which meant she had been doing 80 on the highway the whole way, which was the kind of thing Dorothy noticed and did not comment on. She was 22 years old. She had her grandfather's jaw, the same set to it, the same quality of not moving when a thing had been decided. She got out of the truck and looked at the suitcase and the boxes on the porch, and at Dorothy sitting in Earl's chair with the Bible in her lap, and she did not say anything dramatic. She did not cry. She walked up the 3 porch steps and sat down on the top step and looked at the same wheat field Dorothy was looking at. After a while, she said, "Tell me everything." Dorothy told her. Penny listened the way she always listened, completely without interrupting, with the specific focused quality of someone who is not just hearing the story, but filing it, sorting it, looking for the place where the weakness is. When Dorothy finished, Penny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The POA. Do you remember signing it?" Dorothy said she remembered sitting at the kitchen table. She remembered the lawyer with the tight jacket. She remembered looking at Earl's chair. Penny said, "Do you remember what month Dorothy thought?" "February," she said. It was cold. Penny nodded slowly. She pulled out her phone and made a note. Then she looked up and said the thing that needed to be said. "Aunt Dot, I think they forged some of it." Dorothy looked at her. Penny said, "A general durable POA covers everything. You would have had to sign in front of a notary. I need to get a copy and look at the notarization. If the notary signed off on something you didn't actually sign in full, that's fraud. That's criminal fraud." Dorothy said, "Sandra." Penny didn't answer right away. Then she said, "That would be my guess." They sat there for another moment in the October light. Then Dorothy stood up, picked up the suitcase with one hand and Earl's Bible with the other, and said, "Are you going to help me put these in the truck or not?" Penny put them in the truck. They drove back to Tulsa. Penny's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building near the law school, a place that managed to be both small and cluttered in a way that suggested someone who spent very little time in it. There were case books on the kitchen counter and a deposition transcript on the bathroom floor, and a coffee maker that ran constantly as if it understood its purpose and took it seriously. Dorothy slept on the pull-out sofa and did not complain about the bar that pressed into her back through the thin mattress. She was up at 5:30 each morning. She made coffee with the machine she'd figured out on the first night. She set out 2 cups, one for herself and one for when Penny woke up. She was not a woman who sat still well. By the 3rd morning, she had reorganized Penny's kitchen cabinets, cleaned the grout between the bathroom tiles, and taken apart the stuck window latch in the living room, and repaired it with a flathead screwdriver and a piece of wire from the bottom of the junk drawer. By the end of the first week, she had identified every grocery store within walking distance, established a rotation between 3 of them based on which one had the best produce, on which days, and developed a habit of having dinner on the table by 6:30, which Penny ate gratefully and without ceremony, still reading case notes. Dorothy did not talk much in those first weeks, but she watched. She watched Penny work. Penny Hartwell spent evenings in front of her laptop with county records and court filings open in adjacent windows, cross-referencing deed transfers against the timeline Dorothy had given her. She moved through the material with the quiet intensity of someone who has found the thing she is actually good at and is doing it under conditions that matter. On the 9th day, she found it. Dorothy was washing dishes when Penny said from the table, "Come look at this." Dorothy dried her hands and came over and looked at the screen. She did not understand most of what was on it. Penny pointed to a field near the bottom of the document, a notarization date. The notary stamp was dated February 8th. Penny pulled up Dorothy's phone records, which she had requested as part of her research. On February 8th, Dorothy had been at a doctor's appointment in Broken Arrow from 10 in the morning until nearly noon. The notarization was time-stamped 10:43 a.m. Dorothy had been 22 miles away at the time her signature was allegedly being notarized. Penny sat back in her chair. She said Sandra used a notary she knew personally, someone who stamped a document without actually witnessing the signing. That happens more than people think. It's called a false acknowledgement, and it makes the whole POA void. More than void, it makes it fraud. Dorothy looked at the screen for a long time. Then she said, "What does that mean for the farm?" Penny said it means we can fight it. It means we have a case. But Aunt Dot, there's something else. Something I found while I was looking through the county records. She pulled up a different window. Dorothy looked at the screen. She saw a document header. 1887. Cimarron County. The name Hartwell in capital letters. She sat down. The homestead patent for Ezekiel Hartwell's original 320-acre claim was filed with the General Land Office on April 14, 1887, and signed by President Grover Cleveland on behalf of the United States government. The document had been entered into the Cimarron County record books and had sat there quietly for the better part of 140 years, waiting for someone to look for it. Penny had found it while pulling chain of title records on the Hartwell name across all Oklahoma counties. The 320 acres had been sold in 1962 for the $47 tax debt. But Penny, reading through the deed transfer from that sale, had found something that the county itself appeared to have overlooked or filed incorrectly or simply never followed up on. The sale had transferred the surface rights. There were significant legal questions about whether it had transferred the full patent title given certain conditions. Agnes Hartwell had apparently attempted to write into the sale under duress conditions that had been recorded but never adjudicated. The land was currently listed as tax delinquent property, which meant it could be reclaimed, which meant there was a process, which meant Penny said, looking at her great-aunt across the kitchen table, that the original homestead with the grain elevator was technically in legal limbo, and for $1 in unpaid back taxes, a direct descendant of Ezekiel Hartwell could file a reclamation claim with the Cimarron County clerk. Dorothy said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the photograph Penny had pulled up alongside the legal documents, a black and white image from a 1940s county survey, low resolution, but clear enough to see the shape of it against the flat sky. 5 stories, 60 feet, the rows of ventilation windows. She said, "Is that still standing?" Penny said. "According to the county's last structural inspection in 2019, yes, they flagged it for historical interest. Nobody's touched it since." Dorothy looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she looked at the Bible on the kitchen counter, the one with the names inside. She said, "When can we go?" Penny looked at her. She had been expecting more resistance, more questions, more of the careful deliberation she associated with her great-aunt. She had not been expecting that. She said, "I have a property law seminar Thursday morning. We could leave Thursday afternoon." Dorothy said Thursday afternoon. She got up and started clearing the dinner dishes. That was the entire conversation. If your family had lost something 100 years ago, would you go looking for it? If you knew the thing still existed, that it was still standing somewhere out in the world with your family's name carved into it, would you drive 200 miles on a Thursday afternoon in November to stand in front of it? Most people would say yes. Most people, when it came to it, would find a reason not to go. Dorothy Hartwell was not most people. They left on a Thursday in early November at 2 in the afternoon, the truck loaded with a cooler, a sleeping bag, 2 changes of clothes each in a toolbox Dorothy had assembled over the previous 2 days with the focused intentionality of a woman who expected to find work waiting for her. The drive from Tulsa to Boise City in the Oklahoma Panhandle takes a little under 4 hours in good weather. The weather was not good. A low-pressure system was pushing across the Panhandle from the northwest, bringing the kind of wind that makes the highway feel like it's tilted, leaning the truck sideways in gusts, sending tumbleweed across the road in sudden horizontal flashes that required both hands on the wheel. Penny drove. Dorothy navigated and occasionally made observations about the landscape that were not quite conversation, but not quite not conversation either. They passed through Woodward, where the country starts to open up in earnest, the towns getting smaller and the distances between them growing. Past Laverne, past Felt. The sky doing the thing that the sky does in the Oklahoma Panhandle, the thing that is impossible to adequately describe to someone who hasn't seen it expanding in all directions simultaneously until it becomes not a ceiling, but an atmosphere, something you are inside rather than under. Dorothy watched it all through the passenger window. After a while, she said, "Your father used to love this drive." Penny kept her eyes on the road. She said, "He took you out here," Dorothy said once. "When he was about your age, he wanted to see the elevator for himself. We drove out on a Sunday. Your grandfather talked about it like it was something he was ashamed of. Losing that land. Your dad never saw it that way. He just thought it was interesting. Penny said he never told me about it. Dorothy said he meant to. He was going to bring you when you were old enough. That was his plan." Penny didn't answer. The wind pushed at the truck. She corrected for it without thinking about it. After a while, she said, "He would have liked this. Driving out here to fight for it." Dorothy said yes. He would have. They drove in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable, but full, the way a room is full when the right people are in it. They arrived in Boise City at 6:15. The Cimarron County Courthouse was a low brick building on the main square, built sometime in the 1930s by the look of it, the WPA aesthetic of practical endurance. The county clerk's office was on the ground floor past a hallway that smelled of old paper and floor wax, in the particular institutional calm of places that have processed 100 years of human decisions without editorializing. Vivian Cassidy had been Cimarron County Clerk for 21 years. She was 65 with gray-streaked hair pulled back efficiently and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the air of a woman who had seen most things that could be brought through a county clerk's door and had developed a fair and patient disposition toward all of them. She was closing up for the day when they arrived. Penny knocked on the glass door and held up her credentials, her student bar card, and the preliminary research she had printed and organized into a manila folder during a gas station stop outside Laverne. Vivian Cassidy looked at them through the glass for a moment. She opened the door. She listened to Penny explain the situation briefly and precisely the way Penny did things. She looked at the documents. She pulled out her own records. She cross-referenced the patent number against the county's deed book, turning pages in a ledger that was older than any of them, running her finger down columns of handwritten entries in inks of different vintages. She stopped at a line near the bottom of a page. She said, "Hartwell, Ezekiel T. Parcel, 47-1887 claim. Tax deed transfer, June 1962. She looked up at Dorothy. She said, "Your grandmother's name was Agnes?" Dorothy said, "Yes." Vivian Cassidy looked at the ledger again. She said, "There's a notation here, in Agnes Hartwell's handwriting, which I recognize because we have 6 other documents with her signature. It says, 'Conditions of sale, subject to right of reclamation, by direct blood descendant presenting in person. Witnessed.'" She looked up. She said nobody ever came in person. Dorothy said, "Until now." Vivian Cassidy held her gaze for a moment. Then she reached into a drawer that she had to search for a while to find the right one. She set a small iron key on the counter between them. She said, "This came to us about 40 years ago from a notary office in Liberal, Kansas. Had a note attached, said to hold for Hartwell family." Dorothy looked at the key. She reached into her coat pocket and took out a dollar bill folded once and laid it on the counter. Vivian Cassidy looked at the dollar. She looked at Dorothy. Something moved across her face that was not quite professional and was not quite not professional. She took the dollar. She slid the key across the counter. She said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Hartwell." They drove the 12 miles out of Boise City on a county road that was more suggestion than surface. A 2-track through dried grass, the headlights of the Ranger cutting yellow tunnels in the dark. Dorothy held the iron key in her right hand. She had been holding it since they left the courthouse. She was not squeezing it or rubbing it or doing anything with it that could be called nervous. She was simply holding it the way you hold something that you are not quite ready to put down. Penny drove without speaking. The GPS lost the signal twice. They navigated by the survey coordinates Penny had written on a piece of paper at the gas station outside Laverne. And then the headlights hit it. Dorothy made a sound that she would not have been able to describe afterward. Not a word. Not quite a gasp. Something smaller and more involuntary than either because it was there. Not a ruin. Not a suggestion of something that had once been there. There in the November dark with the headlights of a 2009 Ford Ranger catching the south wall and throwing it back in sharp relief, the grain elevator stood exactly as it had always stood. 5 stories of black pine against the dark sky, exactly as she had carried it in memory for 68 years. The ventilation windows in their perfect rows, the prairie Gothic peak still plumb against the night. And on the south wall in the headlights, catching the light, the way carved stone catches light deep and clean and permanent. Hartwell Grain Est, 1887. Penny stopped the truck. They sat there for a long moment, the engine idling, the wind rocking the truck slightly, the headlights holding that wall. Dorothy said very quietly, "He built it to last." She got out. She walked to the base of the elevator and pressed her palm against the wood beside the carved letters. Not the letters themselves, not yet, but the plain unmarked pine next to them, the wood that had held everything up. She felt the grain of it under her palm, the roughness of weather-worked pine, the warmth that old wood holds even in the cold. Then she moved her hand to the letters themselves and traced them slowly 2 inches deep, clean, precise cuts that a man had made with a chisel in 1888, because he intended them to be there longer than he would. She looked up. The peak of the elevator disappeared into the dark sky. The ventilation windows were black voids, regularly spaced looking back at her. She did not look small standing there. She had been 76 years old for 9 months. She had buried her husband and worked 160 acres alone and watched her son become someone she did not recognize. And she had sat on a porch that no longer belonged to her, with a key that no longer fit the lock. And she had not cried, not once, not in front of anyone. She did not look small. She looked in that moment standing with her hand against the south wall of the Hartwell grain elevator in the cold November dark, exactly like what she was. The last Hartwell standing, the one who came back. Behind her she heard the truck door open and Penny's boots on the frozen ground, and then Penny was standing beside her looking up at the same wall. From somewhere to the north, maybe a quarter mile, a light moved. A lantern or a flashlight coming toward them through the dark at the slow pace of someone old enough to have learned not to hurry. An old man's voice carried across the flat ground before he was close enough to see clearly. He said, "That your truck out there?" Penny said. "Yes, sir." The light came closer. He was tall and had been taller once, the slight forward lean of a man in his early 90s who has spent decades looking at things lower than his own eye level. He had a canvas jacket and a cap with a veteran's emblem on it, and he stopped about 10 feet from them and held his lantern up. He looked at Dorothy for a long time. Then he said, "You got Agnes's eyes. She used to climb that thing every harvest. Said she could see clear to Colorado from the top." Dorothy said, "You knew her?" The old man said knew her and knew her father before her. "Name's Gus Wexler. I'm at the end of that road. Been here since 1959. He looked back at the elevator. He said, "I've watched that thing stand empty for 62 years. Been waiting for a Hartwell to come back to it." He looked at Dorothy again. He said, "Took long enough." They spent that first night inside. At TM. The ground floor of the elevator was a single large space, the original intake room where the grain wagons had pulled in, where the weighing equipment had been, where Ezekiel had stood in the harvest seasons of the 1890s and 1900s and watched the wheat come in from the surrounding farms. The equipment was long gone, carried off, or rotted away, but the room itself was intact. The pine floor was dusty but solid. The walls were sound. The intake doors on the north side were warped in their frames but closed. It was cold. It was the kind of cold that lives in old wood deeper than air temperature, the accumulated cold of seasons and decades. They ran the truck's engine for warmth and laid their sleeping bags on the floor and ate sandwiches from the cooler and did not talk much because the space asked for quiet the way some spaces do because of what they are and what they have held. Before she slept, Dorothy walked to the base of the central ladder and looked up through the 5 floors of the elevator's interior. The floors above her were open grates, each one slightly visible in the darkness. The whole vertical interior like a throat looking upward at a square of cloudy sky through the peak ventilation at the top. She could hear the wind moving through the ventilation windows, a low, continuous note. She went to sleep thinking about Ezekiel Hartwell building this alone in 1887, hauling pine from Woodward, 11 times sinking those iron posts into the clay, fitting each plank by hand. Thinking about what it meant to build something permanent on purpose. Thinking about Agnes coming here before she signed the deed, spending 2 hours in this building with a hammer and a candle. What had Agnes done in those 2 hours? She went to sleep not knowing. The answer was inside the wall. The morning came gray and cold and entirely clear. The panhandle sky doing the other thing it does, the thing after the storms becoming absolutely transparent, the air scoured clean by wind until every edge was sharp, and the horizon was a hard line, and the space between the ground and the sky was so legible it felt like a statement. Dorothy was up before light. She had already walked the perimeter of the elevator by the time Penny woke up, noting the structural condition of each exterior wall, the state of the roof, the iron posts. She had a piece of paper and a pencil she had brought in the toolbox, and she had written down her observations in the methodical shorthand of someone who has spent 50 years maintaining farm equipment and buildings. The structure was sound, more than sound. The longleaf pine, the original timber, had a density that modern dimensional lumber simply did not have, the result of slower growth. Tighter rings, more resin. The kind of timber that does not rot easily, that holds its shape, that lasts. The roof had 2 soft spots on the northeast corner that needed attention, but the ridge was solid and the flashing around the peak was intact. The foundation was sound. The corner posts showed surface rust, but no structural compromise. The building was in better shape than anything she had expected. She was standing on the east side making notes when she heard boots behind her and turned. Gus Wexler was walking over from the county road with a thermos and 2 cups. He said, "Figured you'd be up early." She said, "You figured right." He poured coffee and handed her a cup, and they stood looking at the east wall together for a moment. He said, "I've patched that northeast corner twice over the years. Didn't want to do more than that. Wasn't my building to fix." Dorothy looked at him. He said, "Agnes asked me to keep an eye on it. When she sold the land, she came by my place the afternoon before she signed the deed. She said, 'Gus, I am doing something I am going to regret until I die, and I need someone to watch over what I'm leaving.' I told her I would." Dorothy said, "And you have." He said, 62 years, give or take." They drank the coffee in the sharp morning air. He said, "She left something in there, you know. Agnes, night before she signed, I don't know what. She went in with a hammer and a box and came out 2 hours later and locked the door and didn't say what she'd done. I always figured it was important." Dorothy held the iron key in her coat pocket. She said, "I think I know where to look." What would you do if you walked into a room that hadn't been open in 60 years? If you stood at the door of it, knowing that someone who loved the place had left something behind, deliberately something meant for whoever came looking, would you rush in? Would you be afraid of what you'd find? Dorothy Hartwell was neither. She went in the way she did everything, steadily with her eyes open. The 3rd day was when the first piece of it came back to her. She was on the 2nd floor of the elevator, the floor above the intake room, a lower ceiling space that had served as the operator's level where the weighing mechanisms and the grain chutes had been controlled. She was checking the joinery along the east wall, tapping the wood with the flat of her hand, listening for the particular hollow note that means hidden space, the way you learn to do when you've been maintaining old buildings long enough. On the 3rd tap, 8 feet along the east wall, the note changed. She stood still. She tapped again, and again beside it, and back. The section between the two outer studs, a span of about 3 feet, was hollow behind the planking. Not hollow in the way a wall cavity is hollow in the larger, more deliberate way of something that has been designed. She went to the toolbox and got the pry bar. She worked carefully, pulling the facing planks along the seam, trying not to damage them more than necessary. She found the finished nails, 6 of them recently set, compared to the original framing nails, by which she meant sometime in the last 60 years rather than the last 138. The facing came away. Inside, on a shelf of rough-cut timber, was a tin box. It was about the size of a shoebox, sealed along the lid with a bead of what had once been tar and had hardened over the decades into something close to permanent. The surface was spotted with rust, but the seams were intact. It was heavier than it looked. Dorothy carried it down the ladder to the intake floor and set it on the old pine boards in the morning light from the intake doors, which Penny had propped open with a length of pipe. Penny came and crouched beside her. Dorothy found a flathead screwdriver in the toolbox and worked it along the tar seal, patient and methodical, taking her time, not forcing it. It took about 10 minutes. The lid came up. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its job and kept the contents dry for over 60 years, were several items arranged with the neatness of someone who expected them to be found eventually and wanted the finding to go smoothly. There was money. Old bills, large denomination paper currency from the late 1950s and early 1960s, held together with rubber bands that had long since gone brittle and crumbled at the touch. Penny counted it carefully and came to $3,200 in old bills, the kind of money that had been worth considerably more the day Agnes sealed that box than it was now, and was still enough to work with. Enough to buy materials, enough to give Dorothy Hartwell the beginning of something without having to ask anyone for anything. There were stamps, Oklahoma Territory stamps from the 1890s, the kind that a collector would look at with considerable interest. And there were photographs. Black and white, small format, the kind taken with a box camera. Several of them showed the elevator in earlier periods, the intake room full of grain sacks, men standing in front of it in clothes from different decades. One showed a woman standing at the base of the south wall with her hand braced against it, looking up, her face turned away from the camera, her posture one of someone taking stock of something that matters. Dorothy held that photograph for a while. Penny said quietly, "Aunt Dot, there's more." There were 2 envelopes at the bottom of the tin underneath the oilcloth, sealed with wax that was still solid. One was addressed in a handwriting that was cramped and deliberate, and very old to whoever comes for this. The other, in a different hand, more recent, said, "To the Hartwell woman who returns." Dorothy set both envelopes on the pine floor in front of her. She sat back on her heels and looked at them for a long moment. The November light coming through the propped intake doors, the wind moving through the ventilation windows above. She was not going to rush this. Some things Agnes Hartwell had once told her when she was a young woman, and Agnes was already old, do not benefit from hurrying. You can hurry toward a thing your whole life and arrive before you're ready to receive it. Better to come slowly, better to be ready when it opens. Dorothy took a long breath. She picked up the first envelope. Outside, the wind moved through the panhandle grass with the low, continuous sound it had been making in this place since before anyone had a name for it. Inside the elevator, the old pine walls held the cold and the quiet, and a century and a third of everything that had been stored here, grain and weather and history, and the particular patience of things built to last. She broke the seal. The first letter was written in 1889. Not 1887 when the elevator was built. Not 1888 when it was finished. 1889, 2 years into the life of Ezekiel Hartwell's claim after his first full harvest, after the first winter in which the building had held against everything the panhandle threw at it. He had waited until he was sure, until he knew the thing would stand. The handwriting was cramped and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write without much formal instruction and treated each letter as something that required effort and therefore deserved to be gotten right. Dorothy read it slowly, holding the paper carefully at the edges, aware of how thin it had become over 135 years. It said, "To whatever child of mine reads this in a time I cannot see, I do not know your name. I do not know what the world looks like from where you are standing. But I know you are standing on this ground, or you would not have found this. And if you are standing on this ground, then some part of what I built is still standing too, because I built it to outlast me, and I built it to hold what matters, and I built it because a man who builds nothing permanent has not yet decided he belongs anywhere. The land knows our blood. It will hold your name in its dust until you come for it. I have asked nothing of this ground that it did not give back to me doubled. I have asked it to hold grain, and it held grain. I have asked it to hold water, and it held water. I ask it now to hold this letter and to give it to the one who comes looking. Do not let strangers tell you what is yours. They will try. They have always tried. They will have documents, and they will have lawyers, and they will have the particular confidence of people who believe that ownership is a matter of paperwork. It is not. Ownership is a matter of knowing. You know this ground or you do not. No document makes you know it, and no document takes the knowing away. Come home when you are ready. The land will be here. Ezekiel T. Hartwell, Cimarron County, Oklahoma Territory, March 1889. Dorothy read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and set it on her knee and held it there with one hand while she reached for the second envelope. The second letter was from Agnes. The handwriting was familiar in the specific way of handwriting you have seen on birthday cards and Christmas cards, and the occasional letter over the course of a lifetime, the particular slant and pressure of someone you have known. Agnes Hartwell had written this letter in June of 1962, the month she signed the tax deed, the month she lost the land. It said, "I am selling the land, but I am not selling the claim. I want whoever reads this to understand the difference. The county will have a deed. The deed will have someone else's name on it. That is a legal fact, and I am too old and too tired and too broke to fight it, and I have a son who has just come home from a war and does not need another one to come home to. But a deed is a piece of paper. What Ezekiel built is not a piece of paper. What 4 generations of this family put into this ground is not a piece of paper. You cannot deed away the knowing. I am leaving the patent. I am leaving the will. I am leaving what money I have that the bank cannot find. I am leaving the photographs so you know what this place looked like when it was alive. And I am leaving this letter so you know that losing a thing is not the same as giving it up. The elevator stands. As long as the elevator stands, the claim stands with it. Come in person. Come with the blood right and the intention to stay. The county clerk will have a key if I do this correctly, and I intend to do this correctly. It is possibly the last thing I will do correctly, and I intend to make it count. The land remembers what the deeds forget. Do what is right. Agnes Mildred Hartwell, June 14, 1962. Dorothy sat with both letters on her knee for a long time. The wind moved through the ventilation windows. The November light came through the propped intake doors and lay in a long rectangle on the old pine floor. Penny had not said anything. She had read both letters over Dorothy's shoulder and then moved back and given her great aunt the space that the moment required. She was sitting against the far wall with her knees up, looking at nothing in particular, which was her way of being present without intruding. After a while, Dorothy said she knew. Agnes knew someone would come. Penny said she built for it, same as Ezekiel built for it. Dorothy looked at the letters. She said she was alone when she signed that deed. Vernon was still finding his footing after the war. She had nobody. Penny said quietly, she had us. She just hadn't met us yet. Dorothy looked at her great niece for a moment. Then she looked back at the letters. She said, "There's more in here." There was. Under the oilcloth, beneath the money and the photographs and the 2 letters, was the legal material Agnes had mentioned. The 1887 homestead patent was on heavy paper stock, the kind the federal government had used for official documents in the 19th century, thick and slightly waxy, resistant to moisture in the way that had made it survive 62 years in a tin box inside an Oklahoma grain elevator. The presidential seal was faded but intact. Grover Cleveland's signature was a confident cursive flourish at the bottom. It covered 320 acres. Every legal description was precise, the survey language of the 1880s, meets and bounds and compass bearings. Penny went through it twice with the careful attention she brought to case documents, running her finger under each line. She said, "This is the whole parcel, the full 320 acres. Not just where the elevator sits." Dorothy said Agnes sold it for $47. Penny said she sold the surface rights under a tax deed in 1962. But this patent predates the tax deed by 75 years. And Agnes's notation in the county record about right of reclamation by direct blood descendant was never adjudicated, which means it was never legally resolved either way. Combined with the conditions she wrote into the sale and the fact that we have the original patent in hand, and the fact that you are here in person as a direct blood descendant. She looked up. She said, "This is winnable, Aunt Dot. This is genuinely winnable." Beneath the patent was one more document, a handwritten will, one page, witnessed by two names Dorothy did not recognize, dated May of 1962, 1 month before Agnes signed the tax deed. It said in Agnes's precise hand, "This original homestead shall pass to whichever Hartwell woman returns to claim it in person with the intent to remain. The elevator must not fall. The land must not be broken for any purpose other than what my grandfather broke it for. I leave this not as a legal instrument alone, but as a statement of what this family is and what it is owed by the ground it has worked for 3 generations." Dorothy folded everything carefully and put it back in the tin box. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the lid. Then she stood up. She said, "We have work to do." The work was of 2 kinds and both began immediately. The first kind was physical. The elevator needed attention in specific places. The northeast roof corner that Gus had patched twice a section of the second-floor grating that had weakened the intake doors that had warped in their frames and needed to be planed and rehung. Dorothy began this work the way she had always begun physical work, methodically starting with the most structurally critical items and moving outward from there. Gus Wexler appeared each morning with coffee, and increasingly with tools, and eventually with a contractor named Roy Dunbar from Boise City, 40 years old, a quiet man with thick forearms, in the habit of looking at a problem for a long time before saying anything about it. Roy Dunbar walked the perimeter of the elevator on his first visit and tapped walls and looked at the roof line and crouched to examine the corner posts and said nothing for about 15 minutes. Then he looked at Dorothy and said, "This thing is built better than most buildings I work on that were built last year." Dorothy said, "My great-great-grandfather built it." Roy said he knew what he was doing. He came back 2 days later with materials and a helper and spent a week on the northeast corner pulling the damaged sheathing and replacing it with new boards that he treated carefully so they would weather to match the old ones over time. When he was finished, he stood back and looked at the wall for a moment and said nothing, which was his version of satisfaction. Dorothy paid him with a portion of the money from Agnes's tin box. He charged her half what he would have charged anyone else. She did not ask him to do that, and he did not explain it. Some things in small communities are simply understood. A woman named Norma Hatch, who ran the diner on the main square in Boise City and had been widowed 7 years prior, began leaving covered dishes at the elevator door on Sunday afternoons without announcement or expectation of thanks. The first time it happened, Dorothy found a cast iron pot of beef stew on the step with a dish towel folded over the top and a note that said, "Only figured you could use a hot meal." Dorothy wrote a thank you note after the first one and left it at the diner counter, and Norma Hatch read it and said nothing about it, but kept leaving the dishes. The second Sunday there was cornbread, the third an apple pie. Pastor Owen Griggs from the Methodist congregation in Boise City stopped by one afternoon, a quiet man of 50 who didn't stay long and didn't say much, only that the congregation was glad someone had come back to the Hartwell land and that there was a pew if she ever wanted it. The second kind of work was legal, and it happened simultaneously on Penny's laptop at the fold-out table Dorothy had found in a second-hand store in Boise City and carried up the county road in the truck bed. Penny filed the reclamation petition with Vivian Cassidy's office in the second week. Vivian processed it with a thoroughness and a personal investment that went somewhat beyond the requirements of her position, pulling every related document from the county record and organizing them into a file that was, as she told Penny over the phone, about as airtight as anything she'd seen in 21 years. Penny filed the fraud complaint against Sandra with the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office on the same day. She had the notarization discrepancy, the time-stamped Dorothy's phone records, and two additional pieces of evidence she had found in the county deed records: a prior transaction in which the same notary had signed off on a document for a different client of Frederick Plum's law firm, a transaction that had been quietly settled out of court 18 months earlier. Pattern, she told Dorothy. The law likes patterns. Isolated fraud is harder to prove than habitual fraud. Dorothy absorbed this and said, "What do we do now?" Penny said, "We wait for them to find out what we've done, and then we see what they do." They did not wait long. It was the fourth week when Dorothy saw Brian at the fence. She was coming around the south side of the elevator with a level in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other, marking the wall for Roy's second visit, when she looked up and saw a figure at the county road fence lying 200 yards out. She knew immediately who it was, not because she could see his face at that distance, because of the way he stood. She had known the way Brian Hartwell stood since he was 3 years old, the particular distribution of weight, the slight forward lean of a man perpetually uncertain whether to stay or go. He was not moving. He was looking at the elevator. Dorothy stood still and looked at him looking at it. Ma'am. After about 10 minutes without any visible change of expression that she could make out from the distance, he turned and walked back to a car she had not noticed parked on the county road shoulder and drove away. She went back to marking the wall. She did not tell Penny until dinner, and when she did, she told it the way she told most things, plainly, without commentary, leaving Penny to draw her own conclusions. Penny drew them. She said, "He knows we're here." Dorothy said, "Apparently." Penny said, "That means Sandra knows." Dorothy said, "Probably." They ate dinner in the particular quiet of people who have said what needs to be said and don't see the point in elaborating. The next morning, a car she didn't recognize pulled up the county road, and a man in a jacket that was too thin for November got out and introduced himself as a representative of Meridian Land Partners, a development firm based in Oklahoma City, and said he understood she was the current occupant of the property and he wanted to discuss a potential purchase. He offered $50,000. Why would a stranger offer $50,000 for a house worth 10? If someone came to your door with a number that large for something worth that little, what would you want to know? What would that number tell you that the stranger wasn't saying? Dorothy Hartwell knew exactly what it told her. She had been farming land her whole life. She knew what land was worth, and she knew what it meant when someone offered you 5 times that. Dorothy looked at the man for a moment. She said, "What does your company want with a grain elevator in Cimarron County?" He said the firm was interested in land consolidation in the region, agricultural development opportunities. Nothing specific. Dorothy said, "Nothing specific that's worth $50,000 for a building assessed at $9,000. The man smiled the way people smile when they've been caught oversimplifying and are recalibrating. He said the firm saw a long-term potential in the region. Dorothy said, "Thank you for coming out. The property is not for sale." He left a card. She put it in her coat pocket and went back to work. That afternoon, she gave the card to Penny. Penny looked at it. She typed the company name into her laptop and looked at what came back and sat back in her chair with the expression she got when something confirmed a theory she had already formed. She said Meridian Land Partners is a shell company. It was formed 14 months ago. Its registered agent is a law firm in Oklahoma City that also represents Continental Resources on several regional land matters. Dorothy said Continental Resources. Penny said they're one of the largest oil and gas operators in Oklahoma. They've been buying land and mineral rights in Cimarron County for the last 3 years. Their acquisition map. She turned the laptop around. Dorothy looked at the screen. It showed a county parcel map with highlighted parcels indicating Continental's known acquisitions. The highlighted parcels formed an almost complete ring around a central area. The central area was the 320 acres of the original Hartwell homestead. Penny said there was a geological survey published in an industry journal 18 months ago. Continental commissioned it. It identified a shallow oil formation running through this part of the panhandle, maybe 600 feet down, accessible with modern horizontal drilling, low extraction cost, significant yield potential. She looked at Dorothy. She said the Hartwell land is directly over the center of the formation. Every other parcel they needed, they've already bought. This is the last piece. Dorothy sat with that for a moment. She said Brian knew. Penny said someone at Continental told him, or someone who knew about the survey. That's how Sandra got the idea to go after the farm in Tulsa first. She thought the mineral rights to the Tulsa farm extended to the original claim. She didn't know about the reclamation petition. She didn't know about any of this. She gestured at the walls around them. She said nobody knew about this except Agnes. And Agnes built it so that only the right person would find it. Dorothy stood up and walked to the south wall and rested her hand on the timber beside the carved letters, the same wood she had touched on the first night, already as familiar under her palm as the kitchen counter she had used for 50 years. She stood there for a while. Then she said Agnes was protecting it. All this time. Penny said all this time. Brian came 3 days later. Not to the fence line this time. He drove up the county road in his own car, a Chevy sedan that needed new tires, and parked and got out and walked toward the elevator with the particular gait of a man who has rehearsed something and is hoping the rehearsal was adequate. Dorothy was on the ground floor when she heard the car. She came out through the intake doors and stood at the base of the south wall and waited. Brian stopped about 15 feet from her. He was 48 years old. He had his father's coloring and her own father's jaw, and none of the steadiness of either. He looked like he had not been sleeping well, which she noted without satisfaction. He was wearing a jacket she had given him 4 Christmases ago. He said, "Mom." She said, "Brian." He said, "I need you to know that I didn't understand all of it. What Sandra was doing. I knew about the farm, about the POA. I'm not saying I didn't know about that. But I didn't know she'd falsified the notarization. I didn't know she'd been moving money. I found out about the money 2 weeks ago." Dorothy looked at him without speaking. He said, "I know that doesn't fix anything." She said, "No, it doesn't." He looked at the elevator behind her. He looked at it for a long time with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between recognition and something more complicated. He said, "Dad would have liked this. You being here." She said, "Earl would have been here 6 years ago if I'd told him about it. He always wanted to come." Brian looked at the ground. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I know that's not enough. I know it doesn't come close to enough." She studied her son's face for a moment. 48 years old, the boy she had raised on the farm on Route 11, who had learned to drive on the tractor at 12, who had sat in the same church pew until he was old enough to decide he had better things to do on Sunday mornings. The man who had stood in the farmhouse kitchen and looked away when his wife said certain things about the value of the land. What is the difference between forgiveness and weakness? If someone has wronged you badly and you choose not to carry the weight of it, does that make you soft? Or does it mean you are strong enough not to need the weight? Dorothy Hartwell had been thinking about that question her whole life without knowing she was thinking about it. She knew the answer now. She said, "I forgave you the morning I found my bags on the porch. You need to understand that. I did not carry that weight out here with me." She paused. She said, "But forgiveness is not the same as trust, and it is certainly not the same as surrender." Brian looked at her. She said, "If you mean what you're saying, Penny needs to speak with you. There's a legal process. The POA, the notarization, the money Sandra moved. There are things you know that a court is going to need to hear." Brian said, "I'll talk to her." Dorothy said, "Today. Not when you've had time to think about whether it's convenient." He said, "Today." Penny appeared in the intake doorway behind Dorothy with a legal pad and a pen. She said, "Mr. Hartwell, I have some questions if you have time." Brian looked at his mother one more time. She gave him nothing, no reassurance, no warmth, no punishment. Simply the fact of her standing in front of her great-great-grandfather's grain elevator. He walked past her toward Penny. Dorothy stayed where she was. She tilted her head back and looked up the face of the elevator, 5 stories of black longleaf pine against the November sky. The ventilation windows like a line of open eyes, the prairie Gothic peak sharp against the blue. She thought about Ezekiel. She thought about Clarence in the Dust Bowl years paying the mortgage back dollar by dollar. She thought about Agnes standing here in June of 1962 with a hammer and a box in 2 hours and the particular courage of someone who was losing everything and still making a plan for whoever comes after. She thought about Earl, who had never seen this place and would have loved it. She said not to anyone in particular, just to the wall, just to the wood, just to whatever it was that listened in old places built by hands that were now dust, I'm here. The legal resolution took 4 months, not 4 months of drama, not 4 months of courtrooms and raised voices and reversals, 4 months of the patient grinding work of the law, which moves the way old machinery moves deliberately with significant internal friction, but in one direction. Penny filed the quiet title action in Cimarron County to resolve the disputed ownership of the 320-acre parcel. She filed a civil fraud complaint against Sandra Hartwell and Frederick Plum and the notary in Tulsa County. She filed separately to reverse the deed transfer on the Tulsa County farm using the voided POA as the central instrument. Brian Hartwell gave a deposition in December. He sat across a table from Penny and a court reporter and described in the flat, careful language of a man who has decided to stop managing the truth everything he knew about Sandra's plan. The conversations, the timelines, the name of the contact at Continental Resources who had first mentioned the geological survey. He did not look good in the deposition. He was not supposed to look good. He looked like a man who had made a series of choices by not making choices, which is its own kind of choosing, and who understood that now. Sandra's attorney filed 3 motions to suppress. The court denied all 3. In February, Sandra Hartwell was charged with 1 count of notarial fraud, 1 count of financial elder abuse, and 2 counts of forgery. Her attorney negotiated a plea arrangement in March. She would pay restitution and serve 3 years of supervised probation. It was not everything. Dorothy had not expected everything. The Tulsa County deed was reversed in February. The farm on Route 11 was returned to Dorothy's name, clean title, no encumbrances. The Cimarron County quiet title action was resolved in March. The court found in favor of Dorothy Mildred Hartwell as direct blood descendant of the original patentee presenting in person consistent with the reclamation conditions recorded by Agnes Hartwell in June of 1962. The 320-acre parcel was transferred to Dorothy's name. The 1887 homestead patent was entered into the record as the controlling document. Continental Resources' acquisition campaign in Cimarron County stalled. Without the central parcel, the formation was not economically viable for development. Meridian Land Partners was dissolved. Dorothy received 2 subsequent purchase offers for the mineral rights alone, both of them significant numbers, both from different intermediaries she did not recognize. She did not respond to either. The land was not for sale. The minerals under it were not for sale. What Ezekiel had broken for grain and what Clarence had held through drought and what Agnes had refused to surrender even in loss was not going to be surrendered now. In the first week of April, Brian drove out to Boise City on a Sunday. He did not call ahead. He turned up the county road in his Chevy and parked and walked to the elevator and found Dorothy on the ground floor, which she had been converting over the winter months into a living space. Not dramatically, not in a way that compromised the structure. She had insulated the interior walls and laid a wood stove in the corner, where the old weighing pit had been a cast iron thing she'd found at an estate sale in Liberal, and transported in the truck bed. She had built a simple kitchen against the north wall cabinet she'd made herself from salvaged lumber, a propane cooktop, a deep utility sink. The second floor had become a sleeping area. The upper floors remained as they had been, grain storage levels open and drafty and historically intact. The ventilation windows still pulling air through in the way Ezekiel had designed them to pull air. The timber framing still tight and square after 138 years. It was not a comfortable house. It was not designed to be. It was designed to be honest, the same way the original structure was honest. Every joint, visible, every function, apparent. Nothing hidden that didn't need to be hidden. Brian stood in the intake doorway for a moment looking at what she'd done. He said, "This is something, Mom." She said, "It's a start." He walked around slowly looking at the cabinets, the stove, the way she'd laid the floor back where she'd had to pull it for the stove installation. He ran his hand along one of the cabinet doors. He said, "You made these." She said, "Had some time." He turned and looked at her. He had the look he got when he was trying to say something he hadn't figured out how to say yet. He said Grandpa Vernon was wrong to be ashamed about losing the land. Dorothy looked at him. He said Agnes did what she had to do. She didn't lose it. She held it. She just held it a different way. I think that's what I couldn't understand before. Dorothy said it took me a while to understand it too. He said I've been thinking about what you said, about forgiveness and trust. She said, and he said I think I'm going to need more time for the trust part. She said, "That's honest." He said, "I'm working on it." Dorothy looked at her son for a moment. 48 years old, standing in the grain elevator his great-great-grandfather had built in the county, where the family had started looking a little lost and a little earnest, and about 30 years younger than he had looked the last time she'd really seen him, which was before all of this. She said, "Are you hungry?" He said, "Yes, actually." She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove and set them on the small table she'd put near the intake doors where the morning light came in. She put biscuits on a plate. She sat down. Brian sat across from her and wrapped his hands around the cup and looked out the intake doors at the flat panhandle country. The April sky doing what the April sky does out here, filling up with light from horizon to horizon, the kind of light that makes everything visible. They sat together and didn't talk for a while, which was the most honest thing they had managed in a long time. In late April, Dorothy found the album. She had been working on the second floor, reinforcing the sleeping area partition she'd built along the west wall, and she had pulled back a section of the original interior sheathing to check the stud spacing. Between the sheathing and the exterior wall in the 3-inch cavity, where old buildings hold their secrets, was a flat package wrapped in the same oilcloth Agnes had used for the tin box. She unwrapped it. It was a photograph album, small cloth-covered, the kind sold in dime stores in the 1940s. The cloth had faded from what had probably been blue to a pale gray, but the photographs inside were intact, protected by the oilcloth and the dry panhandle air. She went through it slowly, sitting on the second floor, with the spring light coming through the ventilation windows, turning each page carefully. There were pictures from the 1940s. Harvests. The elevator in the background of several of them, always there, always the same. Men with machinery, women on porches, children she didn't know the names of. And then, on the third page from the back, a photograph that stopped her entirely. It was dated in pencil on the back, in handwriting she recognized as Agnes's June 1956. In the photograph, Agnes Hartwell stood at the base of the south wall of the elevator. She was 46 years old in this picture, though she looked older the way women who have worked hard in weather look older. She was not looking at the camera. Beside her, pressed close to the south wall and looking up at the building with her neck craned back, was a small girl, 8 years old, dark hair. Wearing a dress Dorothy recognized because the fabric had come from a bolt her mother had bought at the dry goods store in Tulsa in 1955 and made into 3 dresses, one of which Dorothy had worn until she was 11. Agnes had written on the back, "Dot Hartwell, the granddaughter I barely know. She loves to climb." She stood under the letters and said, "Grandma, our name is on this building." Like she was the first person to notice. Maybe she was. Dorothy sat for a long time. She knew what she was feeling, but could not have organized it into words that would have done it justice. The particular and nearly unbearable fullness of understanding that you have been somewhere before, that something has been true about you for longer than you knew, that the thread you are holding goes back further than you thought, and is stronger than you thought, and has been waiting for you to find the other end of it. She had been here. She had stood under these letters under her own name carved into this wall when she was 8 years old, and the elevator was already 70 years old, and she had looked up at it with the uncomplicated clarity of a child and said, "Our name is on this building." She had not forgotten it. She had carried it the way she had always carried it, in the pocket of her memory, reaching for it, occasionally not knowing fully what she was reaching for. The image of a black tower against a flat sky, her father's hand on her shoulder. She had carried it her whole life, and now she was back. She held the photograph in both hands and looked at it for a long time, the spring light coming through the ventilation windows of the elevator her great-great-grandfather had built in 1887. The elevator her grandmother had protected in 1962. The elevator she had reclaimed with a dollar bill and an iron key, and a young woman who answered the phone on the second ring. After a while, she heard boots on the ground floor ladder, and Penny came up through the grate, moving with the easy familiarity she had developed with the building over 5 months. She stopped when she saw Dorothy's face. She crossed the floor and crouched beside her, and Dorothy handed her the photograph without saying anything. Penny looked at it for a long time. Then she said quietly, "You've been coming home your whole life." Dorothy looked at the ventilation windows, at the light coming through them, at the dust moving in the light, the way dust moves in old buildings, slow and without direction, going nowhere in particular, in no hurry, as if it has all the time in the world. She said yes. She said, "I suppose I have." That is the thing about land. Land does not stop being a family's just because the deeds change hands. The dust remembers the boots that broke it. The wind remembers the names called across the fields at harvest time, the names of the men and women who worked it and worried over it, and held it when holding it was hard, and lost it when they had no choice, and spent the rest of their lives carrying the shape of it somewhere in the chest, that particular weight that is not grief exactly, but is related to grief, the way hunger is related to wanting. The Hartwell grain elevator had been waiting for Dorothy for 138 years without knowing her name. It kept the letters in the walls. It kept the patent under the oilcloth. It kept the photographs. It kept the record of a little girl who stood under carved letters in June of 1956 and said with the simple declarative confidence of someone stating an obvious fact, "Our name is on this building." It kept all of it. Because that is what things built to last actually do. They last. Not just the wood and the iron and the tight-fitted pine planks. The intention lasts. The love that went into the building of something permanent, the decision a man made alone in 1887 that he was going to build something that would outlast him, that lasts too. It lives in the structure the way life lives in old timber, deep in the grain, invisible, but present, waiting for the right conditions to make itself known. Dorothy Hartwell was 76 years old and locked out of the only home she had ever known. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on a grain elevator her great-great-grandfather built with his hands and a chisel, and 11 wagon loads of longleaf pine in the years when Oklahoma was still a territory, and the sky over the Panhandle was the biggest thing any of them had ever seen. She drove 200 miles on $1 and a key that had been waiting in a county clerk's drawer for 40 years. She came in person. She came with the blood right and the intention to stay. It was the best dollar she ever spent.